Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm just going to take a few moments to introduce the video that comes after this introduction. As you all might be aware, this semester I'm teaching online classes, and we often have at least one or two live sessions every week. But of course, for privacy reasons, I cannot make those sessions available publicly. So what I've decided to do is to edit some of those online lectures as they are recorded and extract from them some useful materials that I can share publicly with a wider audience. So with that hope, I will be making some of these class sessions available to you over the semester. I hope this is useful to you. I hope you can use these in your classes, and I hope you can also use them personally for your own education. You would like me to add something else or, enhance the level of engagement with you through these recorded versions. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much, and let's watch one of the lectures, the redacted version, and see how it goes. Thank you. And here it is. Well, I'm going to go on a tangent, and I'm going to start with a few passages from Pierre McCary's A Theory of Literary Production. This was the only book that Pierre McCary wrote on literary studies. And it came out in late 1960s. And after that, someone asked him, are you going to do anything else? And he's like, no, I'm a philosopher. I'm done with literary studies. And it was a huge book when it came out. But then in American Academy, it didn't catch on that much. But in French and British Academy, this was like a major book. And you can read it in your own time. It's it's written by a philosopher, so he goes block by block. He creates his vocabularies, explains them, and then moves on. But there is a chapter 15, to me, is really crucial, because that's where he explains his concept of what he calls the spoken and unspoken. And this is the famous phrase that Gayatri Spivak famously quotes in Can the Subaltern Speak in her critique of Eurocentric modes of reading, where she says that in order to really understand a text, we must also read the silences of the text. And that is really crucial for you when you engage with non-Eurocentric or non-European or American text, is to understand the silences of the text. Because if you fill that silence with your own meaning-making processes and with your own assumptions, then you will be doing a sort of reading which is centered on yourself. Now, which is okay, because that's always what we bring to a text, ourself, but which then encourages you to complicate that self that comes to the act of reading, right? And if you look at real life, we already do that. Those of you who are in relationships, those of you who love someone or with someone, will always get in trouble if you only brought the self that you think you are to that relationship. The reason we succeed or our partners don't hate us is because we incorporate in our actions with them their self, right? We try to sometimes assume or understand what they would like or how would they like me to respond. And it also has strategic cross-cultural importance. For example, I mean, all of you, I think, are brilliant. We had to take a course on it, which was called, how to understand microaggressions and shit like that, right? Some people still don't get it. But anytime, let's say a female friend comes to you and says, hey, I was with that guy or that professor, and, he said something like this, and it was really offensive. Now, if you're a guy who knows how to look at a question from the point of view of the other, you will say, wow, man, tell me more. That's not good. But if you are like someone who just centers his own self, you're like, you're just being sensitive. And that's a microaggression. That's you telling you are a woman and hence you're being more sensitive to what this guy said. You're assuming that she should feel the same way you do. So what I'm saying is we all row. That would be a good title, I know, for an essay. Good. So, but my point is that when Pierre McCary is talking about reading the silences of the text, is what he's saying is that most of the times what we encounter is the sign in front of it, in front of us, a semiological chain that we read, right? And we assume that it carries everything that it wants to say. And based on that, we perform an act of reading and decipher it. But a semiological chain is posited within a given structure of language and culture. And that part of it, it does not announce. It takes it for granted. And an acute reading of a text would be to explore that silence of the text because it has a bearing on the meaning. I know this sounds like really high theory, but what does it actually mean is that if you are writing a novel, let's say sitting in America, in New York, it's set in New York, you're Philip Roth or whosoever, and the way you talk about the Fifth Avenue or this place, in order for me to understand and experience that novel, what I do also need to know is the culture of urban New York, right? What is the significance of this place and this place, right? Only then I will understand why is he saying this. And that will come from outside the text. That's the silence of the text. That's the text saying, this is a novel about New York. I'm not going to explain to you why Times Square is important and why this is important. You have to fill that gap. You have to read that silence. And that's where our critical consciousness, our training comes in, and we read that. In a novel like this, which you are reading, of course, there are silences which the text doesn't explain, right? Those are the silences about the logic of the culture in which Efuru is existing or performing her identity. There are things that we will have to learn in order to understand the very matrix within which the story is plotted, right? And that's important for you as literary critics to keep in mind, that especially if you're reading a novel that comes from another part of the world and tells a story from another part of the world, the worst you can do it is to reduce it to an understanding which is only informed by your own prejudices or preferences. Better would be to try to inform yourselves about the meaning-making processes in that particular culture, and then trying to read it with that kind of nuance. The thing, and that is what we call the metropolitan overdeterminism, is not just that they're consciously thinking, how would it translate to a European audience? There are, of course, material causes for it. You have to send it to a publisher in the West. You have to have an agent. They are already telling you this is in vogue, this is being published, this will not get published. So there are a lot of gatekeepers that you have to go through in order to get published. And then that's why I had mentioned in a previous conversation that the dilemma of a post-colonial author or an African author is the same one as that of a science fiction writer or a fantasy writer. And this was from Isaac Asimov, because what he said was that a science fiction writer cannot just assume that the readers would be privy to the world that he or she is creating. He or she must also create the world in which the story is happening. So a lot of effort then in fantasy writing and science fiction writing is also directly or indirectly making the reader aware of the world that you are creating. And a lot of that effort goes into post-colonial writing, especially if you're telling a very native story. Now, there is another good critique of it that comes from Ejaz Ahmed in his book on In Theory. right? Where he's indicting post-colonial studies, but post-colonial writers. And he talks about that, okay, now when you look at the post-colonial canon, the authors are anticipating what are the needs of a metropolitan audience. And so you will always see oppressed women, you will see a tyrant or two, a military dictator, a local, zamindar or landholder oppressing certain people, because these are certain expected tropes in the third world novel, in the post-colonial novel. And people internalize it and they proffer it to a metropolitan audience. My view is not that cynical, right? I actually published 2 articles in the last 3 years about Pakistani writing in English. And so what I was trying to say was not Pakistanis are proffering their dirty laundry to a Western audience. My point was, what is the debate between the authorial right to represent, right, and the native reader's right to insist that the stories that are being told about them not be just, stereotypical representations of their own culture. So I attempted it twice. First time I tried to read it through Hans Robert Joss, right, and his idea of horizon of expectations, right? And I was trying to say is that there is a horizontal gap, the way the authors represent India, Bangladesh, Kenya, and the way the local readers expect them to represent, they haven't caught up with that. The second time I attempted to discuss the same question, I went to it through Pierre Bourdieu and his concept of the field, okay, and his concept of habitus, because that in order to understand where an author is coming from or where a reader is coming from, we have to locate their habitus. What is their meaning-making process? How is that developed? What are their sensitivities? So to like a very long and convoluted answer to your question, I think that is a huge thing on the minds of most of these writers. Now, think of Chinua Achebe. The reason things fall apart became so successful wasn't only because it was a novel about Oquanako, right? It became successful because formalistically, in terms of its form, novelistic form, if you take out the African part of it, it is a quintessentially British or American novel. What do we look for in a traditional modernist or realist American novel? First thing we formalistically look, is it plot driven or character driven? Right? Is it a story of one main character's struggles, successes, and ultimate failure, right? Every single thing in that novel formalistically is, what is the first line of Things Fall Apart, right? He was famous in 5 villages. Why? Because his father was a local chieftain? No, because of his physical prowess, because he was a wrestler, right? And so we already get the story of a self-made man, right? Within a culture which is almost absolutely foreign to any of the European readers. So then you're immediately reading the story of a flawed main character. Think of it this way, Achebe doesn't give us in Oquanako a magical black figure. He gives us a flawed character who fails at the end, right? Who is too proud. So he's writing a Western novel, right? How does he complicate it? Is by the setting and by infusing the proverbs and his own vocabularies there. So absolutely that burden of inhabiting a certain space where you are meeting the demands of the market, you are slightly adopting the role of a cultural informant, but then going beyond that to tell a different kind of story. Now, as far as meeting the demands of the market is concerned, that applies to American writers as well. And the problem with post-colonial writing, which I have noticed within the Pakistani context, is it's not just that you have to deal with the metropolitan market. A lot of people in Pakistan, especially even in academia, consider that these writers are not Pakistanis, or they are traitors, or they are, not true Pakistanis. And it's not just peculiar to Pakistan. If you read Ngugi Tiangos, right? We read it in our class, the novel, Devil on the Cross, right? Remember the opening of Devil on the Cross, where he says he knows that he will be criticized for writing about the terrible things that are happening in Kenya. And he uses that famous phrase. He's like, if I see a hole in my yard, do I cover it up with leaves? And then have my children fall into it, or announce to everyone there is a hole in my yard? So you can see even Ngugi Tiango writing in Gikuyu has this on his mind, that some people who read it will say, you are being too critical of our nation, right? So it has to then be more, if you really are attuned to that kind of criticism or responsive to that, it will impact your writing. It impacts my scholarly writing. Absolutely, when I'm writing something about Islam, writing something about Pakistan, I have to make sure that it doesn't come across as me sitting in America criticizing Pakistan, right? It has to come from a place of love and from within, right, within the culture. There is another thing that comes across to me in the novel, and you can see it throughout, but it's very clear on page 136, and that is that Efuru is also doing what we call a double shift, right? And it's very clear because it says that in the morning, when she and Gilbert, her second husband, gets married, now Efuru performs all her wifely duties, keeping an household and everything else. But beyond that, she is also a successful trader. But in order to have a respectable female identity, she must do both. She can't just be a trader and leave the household to someone else. And that comes across pretty clearly on page 136. She says, the first year of Efuru's second marriage was a happy one. Gilbert loved and respected her. Efuru, on the other hand, knew the duties of a wife. She did not for one moment slack in her duties. She did not only take good care of her husband, she was sweet to her mother-in-law. She did not for one day give her cause to be dissatisfied. That is she as a wife, right? Then down below, any trade she put her hand to was profitable. Soon Gilbert began to contemplate building a house of his own and buying a canoe. Efuru told him that a canoe would be better at that stage. So they bought a canoe and gave it out on hire, and this fetched money for them. So while she is being a good wife, right, and performing all the duties socially required of a good wife, she's also the one driving their economy, right, and making them successful. And these are the two things that, in my way, if you remember our reading of Relations of Rule, right, is that even within the economy of this subculture, Efuru is successful not simply because she's a good wife and performs the duties expected of her, but she's also the more prudent one, the one who has more wisdom, and the one who is responsible for their financial success. This trope, and before I open it up for your conversation, is also prominent in other post-colonial writings. Remember, I mentioned to you that the first Urdu novel was published in 1876, and it was called Miratul Urus, right? A Bride's Mirror. And it was a didactic novel. The didactic novel in a sense that the novelist wanted to argue that women should get education. Muslim women should get education. In order to do that, he creates two sisters as two competing characters, the younger sister and the older sister. Now, the younger sister is the one who gets some early education and is educated. The older sister is traditional and she doesn't get any education. And it's the younger sister then who trains her husband in a way that he can be successful as a law clerk in a court, and trains him to be more responsible because they get married young. And then while at home, she starts her own private school, tutors kids, and she's offered as the example of this woman who doesn't just carry a whole household financially, but who's also responsible for the success of her husband in the public sphere. And that trope figures really prominently in traditional Urdu and Hindi novels of even later novels, that even if the women are reduced to the private sphere, their role there isn't just that of child rearing and being mothers and daughters. It's also connected to the success of their male counterparts in the public sphere. And that's the role that we see Efuru here performing as well. And so what is the relations of rule or power structure within which she is doing that? That would be a good question to ask. This is the first time in her life that in a way she is resting, right? She's successful, but she has just left her husband. And that's why I consider it as an African womanist novel, because her escape from the given of life, right? And the way she creates her space as a single divorced woman of her own choice is articulated within a local myth of their own culture, and that is the myth of Ohamiri, right? Which is a problematic figure. And you will encounter her when we read Joys of Motherhood, because that's also a Nigerian novel. And at the last part of the novel, the same goddess is invoked over there. And a similar kind of question is posed by Buchi Emeshita as well, right? And the question is that, okay, she has left her husband, she has just had her conversation with her friend, and she has told him, no, there is no way I'm going to let him back in my life. And so she has reached that solution that she is going to live like the life of a single woman, like the river goddess. But there are a lot of other likenesses too, right? That the river goddess herself has no children, even though women come to her to pray for children, the irony in that. And in that sense, Efuru, throughout the novel, has been the character to whom people come for help. She has helped other women, right? But see, like, if we attribute it to the narrator, how would it impact our understanding of it? That would then be the general narrator asking a question of Efuru's decision, right? Or if we attribute it to Efuru, I mean, if she has just decided that she has lived a life, she's gonna kind of let go of these entanglements. She's still young, she's wealthy, she's beautiful. But part of her longing is what? I mean, the biggest tragedy in her life was when she loses her child. Or what caused the trouble in her marriage is that she cannot conceive. So maybe that's one of the very few longings that she has had no children who survived at least. And that is also the tragedy of the lake goddess, like of Ohamiri. But the joys of motherhood is a Nigerian phrase I will find out in original language. It's a euphemism that is used. That's why Bushi Amishita's novel is named Joys of Motherhood, is because when women ask each other or talk about each other, if someone has not had children, they will say, oh, she has not had the joy of motherhood, right? Now, the irony there when you read Bushi Amishita's novel is how joyful is it for a mother to raise children? That's the question that we encounter in that novel. The novel ends at that question, but we already know, having read Efuru's story, that she is well respected, that she has reached this decision rationally, and she has reached a stage in her life where she is at peace, right? She's not worried about being a mother. She's not worried about retaining her husband. She has confronted him and taken him to the goddess to profess in front of the goddess that she did not commit adultery. And if she did, she should be punished. She has resolved that. Her reputation is intact socially. So in that sense, she is a successful woman. The question then is, does she need to be a mother to be a successful woman, or can she just be a successful woman as she is, which I think is the point. Know that she materially probably won't need any help from her father. She is independently wealthy, but having that, having the presence of her father at her back, I think materially and symbolically means a lot, right? Especially in a culture where people always know where you came from. You will see that in Joys of Motherhood as well, and that is also set in Nigeria. But that idea of the patriarchal home as a safe space for women isn't just integral to Nigeria. You will see that in Chicana writing. Did I mention Sandra Cisneros' Woman Hollering Creek, the short story? Remember when she's trying to escape back to Mexico, what is she remembering? That her father had told her that this house will always be there for you. So she knows that she can return that. In our language, in Punjabi, there is a noun that women use for their parents' house, right? So in Punjabi, we call it peka. In Urdu, we call it meka. I don't know if it's in Bengali, Saif, or not. That women basically say, I mean, and in local parlance, in vocabularies of women's private sphere, women always say that, you know, if something happens to me, I will go back to my parents. So in a way, that plays as a social safety net for her. And so that's why when her father dies, I think is also she's feeling, all right, I don't have this to fall back on anymore. This is the first time she is all by herself, right? And that is the decision from beyond that. How will she conduct herself? As a woman with no brothers or no father, or as a woman who's autonomous and can decide to live by herself. And I think that's what she chooses. So the idea is that her actions, of course, will be expressed within the living culture in which she lives, right? But within that living culture, she explores the limits of her agency to the limit. Right? So how does she do that? She always knows what the norm is, and then either works against it or slowly bends it to what she wants from it, right? And that is an autonomous, in a way, response, because when she chooses her own husband, she also knows what she's going against, right? So in order to balance that, what she says is, let's postpone the dowry, right? But in order to appease the men that her father sends her, she uses the same custom of hospitality and everything else to defang them and send them back without forcing her to come with them. So in one way, then her autonomous actions absolutely need a very acute understanding of how power works, right? And within that, what is it that she can assert? Simply, she's saying, I am not the kind of woman who works in the field, dude. So you go work in the field, I will trade, right? So, and she can do that basically also because Adizu is crazy about her, but she knows her own value as a person, right? But then throughout her career, you see her where she can push against the boundaries, she does, but by and large, herself is constituted by the expectations of same culture. What constitutes valuable womanhood? What constitutes valuable? I mean, she's the one who chooses the second wife for her husband, right? The mistake that we should not make is reading her as this submissive wife who must go and choose a second wife for her, but that she's working within the paradigm of an elder wife, right? That because if we read it differently, then we are expecting of her a behavior which within the logic of the novel she cannot have. And that is the behavior of the way we imagine an autonomous Protestant middle class white woman. Because throughout the novel, we already see that she has no access to either that kind of logic or that mode of thinking, other than towards the end of the novel when her husband, when they are living in a city. So her mode of resistance and expression of identity will always be within the limits of the culture that she exists. But that what the novel also teaches us is that there is a possibility for that, within the Igbo local culture, there is a possibility of tweaking that particular culture to your own advantage as a woman if you're smart enough and successful enough. I think that's more important to learn within that. Now, ideally speaking, as someone who tries to think in planetary terms, I would be happy to take any revolutionary ideas of change and female equality and gender and merge them with any native culture, because I don't believe in any kind of purist cultural identity. But within the logic of the novel, I don't think so we can expect to read her, whether or not she's an autonomous subject, from a Eurocentric understanding of agency and being autonomous. And I think that is what Mohanty kind of tried to teach us through her discussion of Western feminism and its assumptions. But within that, as I pointed out to you, that the female genital mutilation, as a scholar, I'm opposed to it, and that's what I call it. When you read people's defense of it, famously Jomo Kenyatta, the founder of Kenya, even though he was a sociologist, wrote a very erudite defense of it. But that's where you take a stand. You basically say, no, this I disagree with. I don't care what the cultural logic is behind it, because that's where, as a scholar, you're saying, this is a wrong practice, this needs to be eliminated, and even though within the novel it is not normalized, but it is offered to us as a rite of passage, right, by a cohort of women. But we can keep our autonomous opinion of saying this is a wrong practice, whether it happens in Africa, Egypt, or elsewhere, it should not be done. And that's where we can build a consensus with international feminism. But what we are trying to train ourselves is not reading how oppressive a culture is, because in order to make that claim, what we have to then assume is, where does our idea of non-oppressive come from, right? But the point is, as a cultural critic, if I go into Pakistan and write about gender hierarchies in Pakistan, what would be a more effective argument? Would it be a more effective argument if I tried to prove that somehow America is an advanced country, we have reached a kind of equality in genders, and women are autonomous and do whatever they want, and that is what Pakistanis should adopt too? Or should I work with the local culture available itself and say, here is room within your own religion, within your own, here are historical precedences. There is nothing wrong with considering women your equal, with giving them the respect that they deserve, or considering them as autonomous individual subjects. I'm going to prove it to you by reading your own sacred texts. That's the first step. If there is nothing in there, then you go and challenge those assumptions, right, outside of religion. But any attempt that is purely Western is going to fail against people who are caught in the web of thinking that is social or culturally based, right? So sometimes you have to open the space from within, right? So Efuru creates a space for herself as an individual subject, even though traditionally she does everything that a traditional young woman ought to do, gets her circumcision, marries twice, tries to have children, but at the same time develops this alternative lifestyle, which is also inscribed in her own culture, of becoming a successful trader, a prudent spender and saver of money, so that by the time she reaches a certain stage where she has to make a decision whether or not she's going to stay with her husband, she has the means, because of her own industry and her own hard work, where she doesn't have to worry about where is she going to live if she leaves her husband, right? Two, while she has that, she also has the assurance that she has the house of her father, right? So there are two strains of safety net, for one that she has created herself through her public actions as a trader, and two that the tradition has granted her, right? And she's using those both without repudiating one of them, right? In my way, then, that is a more complicated and subtle engagement with the power structure. At certain times, any kind of cultural hierarchy needs an open challenge, right? So, and that open challenge must come from within, but must be in solidarity with your global counterparts. That's why I openly believe that there is only one way of thinking the world that can confront religion and religiosity, and that is Marxism. Because what it tells you is, if you want to enter me, enter my world, leave religion behind. This is the material world in which we live. It has an agonistic class structure, and if you follow what we teach you, you will destroy that class structure. So Marxism, anywhere in the Islamic world, if you want to see where secular thought has built inroads, it was the leftists, right? So Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, the only powerful secular constituencies were always the Marxist political parties, because the precondition was you had to leave religion outside of it. There is no other political movement or economic system that can do that, right? Because those others always play with religion and religious sensitivities, right? When we destroyed those Marxist movements, United States, of course, was crucial in that, right? What replaced them? What replaced, the Marxists in Syria, in Lebanon, in the occupied territories, in Algeria, right? In Pakistan? The religious fundamentalists, right? in Afghanistan, right? What was the Afghan war about? Because Amal and Parcham, two Marxist political parties, had won the election. When they came into power in 1978, the first two legislations that they moved into the parliament was one about women's education and second about equality of men and women. These two legislation prompted a small faction of religious leaders in the Nuristan province to rise up against this un-Islamic instance of the government. Americans pumped their money into it, Saudis put their money into it, and it became a war, right? And so who did we obliterate in Afghanistan? The Marxists. Who replaced them? The Taliban and everyone else, because that vacuum is filled by traditionally same Jonathan, absolutely. If we had not replaced Mossadegh with the Shah of Iran, they were right on their way to becoming a leftist socialistic democracy. And they were very well advanced in that, right, in terms of political awareness. And so when United States CIA replaces Mossadegh with the Shah, here is where we are in Iran. So the idea, so as a scholar, and this is like now completely off the topic, is first of all, what I'm saying, not to read patriarchy or anything in this novel in order to forgive it, right, or to apologize for it. But the remedies that are offered, we have to ask ourselves, if I am thinking a certain way about Efuru's actions, right, what are the assumptions behind that thinking? Why am I thinking that way, right? And why do I expect of her to act a certain way? Whereas within the logic of the novel, we already know that she's pushing against pretty much all the over-determining dictates of her culture. Sometimes because of the force of her will, sometimes because of ingenuity, sometimes in solidarity with other women, sometimes, just to test the system and its limits, right? So within that, when we read the end of the novel, right, we know that she is not necessarily, a nuclear scientist or, someone who has a tenure track position somewhere, but has she become an autonomous female subject, right? And if she has, what were the enabling conditions, cultural and individual, that she has mobilized in that process? And that would be, in my sense, a more sensitive reading of the text, right? A more nuanced reading of the text. And Mohanty mentions that too, is that the early change in India and elsewhere was brought about by the reformist movements, right? So in Hindu majority areas, it was the thought of Ram Mohan Roy, right? In the Muslims, the major figure that comes to my mind was Maulana Mumtaz Ali. Now, Ram Mohan Roy, with his leftist leanings, was already working towards against caste, right? And his idea was, okay, let's retweak it, let's make the public sphere accessible to more people. Against him was the figure of B.R. Ambedkar. Right? B.R. Ambedkar got his PhD from Columbia in 1930, I think, which is called An Annihilation of Caste. I think it was published in 1938. Now, Ambedkar, so Ram Mohan Roy's stance was, how can we reform the given structure of Hinduism and Hindu society, right? Ambedkar, since he came from the downtrodden classes, from out-of-caste Hindus, from the Dalit community, basically takes Western knowledge and says, we need to think the caste differently and eliminate it. Because he knew that reform is not going to work. What would work is a restructuring of Hindu society in which caste doesn't play that kind of a role, right? Now, keep in mind that B.R. Ambedkar was also the framer of Indian Constitution, So it's not that he didn't work as a reformer. He worked inside the system at least until the time he writes the Indian Constitution as Indian law minister. And within that writes the protections for the minorities and for the non-caste Hindus, right? But beyond that, then there comes a stage in his life, in his career, where he says, you know, guys, this is not working out for us, non-caste Hindus. So then as a final act of defiance, I think about 2 years before his death, he holds a public meeting of his followers. 300,000 of them join him, and they all convert to Buddhism on one single day, in defiance of the Hindu caste laws and Hindu caste system. So that is one way of confronting one of the most stringent social systems in the world, which is the caste system. First, working through the system, trying to refine it, writing a constitution, and then finally confronting it face to face, right? If you look at the Muslim scenario, and I have the book sitting right there, in 1898, Mumtaz Ali, who was a good scholar, but not a leading Muslim scholar, he decides that he was going to become an advocate for women's education. So he picks up this one verse in the Quran from the chapter called An-Nisa, the women, which says in Arabic, Ar-Rijalu Qawwamuna ala Nisa, right? Which a lot of Muslim scholars in India had already always translated as men are rulers over women, right? And based on that one verse of the Quran, then they will give you the hierarchy of gender and the women's subservient role within it. Now he picks up that one verse and he goes to the Arabic etymology of the word and he says, Qawwam is never used in the Quran as a cognate to Hakuma, which means rulership. Qawwam, he goes to its root and he then points to the readers that Qawwam means a pillar, right? A support. So the best translation would be men are sustainers of women, one, and two, they must support women. And from that, then he extrapolates that men's role in the society is secondary. If they are a support, what are they supporting? A roof. So what is superior? The roof, that is the woman, right? So he refutes all the major claims of male superiority over women by using the Quran and Hadith, right? By the time he is done with it, he has already created a space in the Indian culture for women's education. He has launched a debate about equal rights for women, right? By one book. So significant was that book that in 2008, there was a Supreme Court case in India on the issue of marriage and divorce, where the lawyers actually go back to this text to cite it as an example of Islamic commentary and jurisprudence, right? So who had more impact then on the rights of women in India, Mumtaz Ali or, I don't know, Benazir Bhutto or someone else, right? And the reason he had more impact was because he worked from within the system. My point is not that you stop there. Once you have created a toehold, then you can bring more liberating ideologies and open up the system. So this concludes this edited version of a live lecture. I'll be back with more, and please keep an eye out for these, and I hope these are useful to you. Thank you so much, and as always, peace and love.